Dennis Wieboldt III is a JD PhD student in history at the University of Notre Dame, where he is a Richard and Peggy Nopart Premier Fellow at the Graduate School and Edward J. Murray Fellow at the Law School. The first Notre Dame student to concurrently pursue a JD PhD in history, Dennis has authored more than a dozen scholarly articles and book chapters on religious liberty, civil rights, constitutional interpretation, and related subjects. Welcome, Dennis.
Thank you, and thanks all for being here. It feels like a bit of a homecoming to see a lot of familiar faces. As you may have seen from the draft that I circulated, this presentation comes from an article that's forthcoming in the Journal of Supreme Court History. It's very much a work in progress still, so I'll look forward at the end to your comments and questions. I'll talk here for just about 30 minutes, and then I'll open it up to everyone. So the title of the paper, Century of Struggle for School Choice, comes from a diary entry that a religious liberty litigator by the name of William Bentley Ball made shortly after arguing his first case before the U.S. Supreme Court in 1971. And that case was called Lemon versus Kurtzman, an infamous case or a famous case, depending on who you ask. I'll talk about the case more later, but I hope you'll see, just based on the title, Century of Struggle, that Ball, like many American Catholics in his milieu, saw the battle for school choice in Lemon versus Kurtzman, which was a case about public funding for private religious education, as very much a battle. Manichaean language sort of suffused the environment in which these litigators worked, and it very much shaped the way that they approached these later 20th century church-state controversies. And as I'll hope to show today, part of the reason why religious liberty litigators like William Bentley Ball came to see the battle for school choice as indeed a battle in the 1970s owes much to the early 20th century, and in particular to the 1920s and 30s, when the status of American Catholics in the United States was much different than it was by the 1970s. So just a brief note here at the outset on sort of the historiographical context for the paper. So we have a lot of great studies in the field of American legal history that take sort of a longitudinal approach to studying repeat litigators and litigation sort of organizations that appear before the Supreme Court. Probably the most famous is in the context of civil rights. So we have several great studies of Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP, and how over a several decade-long period, these strategic litigators sort of created cases in the lower courts, designed them in very particular ways with an eye towards moving the law in a particular direction at the courts. This is sometimes called cause lawyering. And so we have we have really excellent studies in the civil rights context. Also in the commercial regulation context, there's a book from several decades ago called The New Deal Lawyers, which is a study of lawyers in New Deal administrative agencies, which did the exact same thing. We have a similar sort of setup in the context of free speech. We have an excellent book on the ACLU's decades-long campaign to expand the scope of free expression rights. But with one exception, the book in the center of this slide here, To Build a Wall, we really don't have any longitudinal studies of religious liberty litigators or institutions. And this has been a bit of a paradox for me, because the religion clauses, like the Equal Protection Clause, like the Free Speech Clause, has been subject to very much the same type of sustained Supreme Court litigation as we've seen in these other contexts. So I think this area is ripe for further historical research by me and hopefully others. And so the great thing about William Bentley Ball, thinking about longitudinal studies of cause lawyering in the context of the religion clauses, is that he was one of few lawyers to argue this many, as you see on the slide, religious liberty cases before the Supreme Court over a 2-decade-long period. Interestingly, he actually lost more of these cases than he won, so his checkered record might seem to suggest that he was a relatively marginal member of the Supreme Court bar who sort of showed up and didn't do an altogether great job. But I think that's the fact that he lost some of those cases is actually less important than it may seem, and this is for two reasons. First is that the major cases that he lost, now some of them have been reversed by the Supreme Court, and some of them are likely to be potentially reversed, or at least their implications now seem much different than they did when they were initially decided. So Lemon versus Kurtzman, which, as I mentioned, was his first case, argued in 1971. That case was recently overruled just a few terms ago in a case called Kennedy versus Bremerton School District, which sort of changed the entire way that Establishment Clause challenges are litigated. So the arguments that William Bentley Ball raised in Lemon have now been vindicated. So that, in its own right, I think, suggests that further studies of that litigation is important. Another case that I'm currently writing about, Bob Jones University versus United States, on the tax exemption of private religious institutions or private institutions generally. The Trump administration has invoked Bob Jones as precedent in its efforts to revoke the federal tax exemption of universities, including Harvard. So he lost that case, but its implications remain. And then perhaps his most famous representation, which he won, was a case called Wisconsin versus Yoder, which was about the right of Amish families to send their children, to withdraw their children from public schools after the 8th grade. That was his most famous victory, and the Supreme Court just last term in Mahmoud versus Taylor, in a decision by Justice Alito, described Yoder as an important case of this court. And the parental rights movement has very much been organized around Yoder and the precedent that it set. And so I won't talk too much about those other cases today, but this is just all to say at the outset that these cases and Ball's repeated representation before the court, I think, suggest that he's an appropriate subject of study for legal historians in particular, but also, I think, political historians and religious historians. In these books here on the bottom, two of them, they're books about individual cases that Ball argued. So I don't want to suggest that nobody's ever written about Ball before. Certainly there have been some studies, but they've been limited in scope to individual cases that he's argued. So we don't yet have sort of as I've said, a long-term view of the intellectual formation that he underwent and how that shaped his advocacy before the court. And so with the rest of my time today, I want to walk through some of the stages of the argument that I make in the paper, and then conclude by returning to Lemon. So the paper begins with Walter Bentley and May Foley Ball, who were William Bentley Ball's parents. It was a relatively poor family that he was born into in 1916 in Rochester, New York. His father and his mother, but more so his father, traveled on what was called the Chautauqua Circuit, or an outgrowth of the circuit called the Red Path Circuit. The Chautauqua movement was founded in the late 19th century, and as is relevant for this paper, sort of the movement combined populist economic concerns that really crystallized towards the end of the 19th century, and then in the beginning of the 20th century sort of paired that with what would become sort of the middle-class desire for moral reconstruction. And so the best sources that we have from William Bentley Ball's very early family life come from these Chautauqua programs, where we see a couple major themes that recur in William Bentley Ball's later life. So the first is sort of the sense of patriotism, maybe manifest destiny also is a way that it could be described. As you'll see here, these are some programs from Walter Bentley Ball's performances on the left. The red, white, and blue imagery, of course, is not a mistake. And also preserved are the songs that he would sing on the circuits, as well as sort of the interludes that he would offer, which were more sort of narrative, where he would describe the songs that he would perform. And what we see in these early 20th century Chautauqua programs that Walter Bentley Ball was performing is a sense of optimism about the nation and its future. He told stories about the nation's past to narrate a story of continuity sort of in the life of the United States, and very much had a sense that Americans were on sort of a mission. Again, that's why I think the manifest destiny term is appropriate. Even just this one quote I have on the slide, crude were their ways and rude their life, but here in the valleys of the Cumberland were born the apostles of freedom, whose children were destined to create a new history of the world. So he was talking there about predominantly European immigrants to the United States, and he very much saw them as on an errand in the New World. In addition to sort of this patriotic theme, we also see some interesting discussions in Walter Bentley Ball's performances of race and its relationship to religion. So Walter Bentley Ball was, his exact religious commitments are not entirely certain. It seems as though he was sort of vaguely Christian, but not Catholic. His wife was very Catholic, and that was William Bentley Ball's primary religious influence. But what we see here in just the one example that I offered, he's describing a type of musical performance that arose from formerly enslaved African Americans. And what he does, both with respect to African Americans but also to Native Americans, is he expresses a degree of admiration for their Christian spirit. So he describes here the great burden of the earthly hardships that were imposed upon African Americans during slavery. But then he contrasts that with their looking to Jesus and how in their musical performances they were sustained in Jesus by the promise of life to come. So it's very much an admirable sort of framing that he offers for a whole host of Americans, not only white immigrants to the United States, but also, as I've said, African Americans and Native Americans as well. So in the early 20th century, the advent of the talk radio basically led the Chautauqua circuits to eventually decline by the 1920s. And because Walter Bentley Ball and his wife were really performers, they needed to look for new employment once the Chautauqua circuits faded. And so they moved from Rochester to Cleveland, Ohio, which in the decade before 1930 was the sixth largest city in America, so it was very much an industrial powerhouse. And I should also add that Walter Bentley Ball grew up about 100 miles away from Cleveland in Ohio as well. So the exact reason for their move to Cleveland is still a little bit uncertain in the extant archival record. But in any case, the Ball family moves to Cleveland. They're still poor at this time. They survived mainly off of May Foley Ball's salary as a piano instructor. And it's during this period in Cleveland that I think William Bentley Ball develops many of the ideas that would later sustain him in his legal advocacy and also his sort of public-facing persona. And so before I describe some of those ideas that he develops, I think it's helpful first just to situate. So Cleveland in the period that William Bentley Ball is coming of age, he graduates from high school in 1935. In the period immediately before the Great Depression, Cleveland, as I've said, is a relatively thriving industrial powerhouse, a lot of manufacturing, a lot of trade running through the city on the railroads. Cleveland's located on Lake Erie, so it's in a good location between sort of Chicago and some of the eastern metropolises. After Black Tuesday, however, the state of Cleveland economically, as with many other cities, declines quite rapidly. So just by way of example, in 1928, there was about $1 million of federal investment in the city. By 1933, it was $15 million, and by 1936, it was $40 million. And so this is important, I think, because William Bentley Ball, as he's coming to sort of a degree of intellectual maturity as a high school student, he's able to see, because his family lives at various rental homes in the suburbs, and then he's also involved in some initiatives in the city, he is able to see sort of the benefits of New Deal era investment in Cleveland. So he doesn't, although he's associated frequently with the conservative legal movement, which later takes on a very sort of anti-government or pro-small government approach. William Bentley Ball, from a young age, sees the value that actually federal investment can have to improve everyday people's material living standards. So he doesn't, unlike some of his later contemporaries, think Reagan administration era, he never counsels sort of complete abolition of the government or says that the government should have no involvement in anything. So he takes a sort of middle way that I'm happy to talk about later. Another important feature of Cleveland during this time is that it's very racially segregated and also segregated from the perspective of religious and ethnic enclaves. So I have on the screen here a 1939 HOLC report, and of course I have the image there of the redlined maps. There's one big, of course there's many major through lines through the city of Cleveland, but one of them was Euclid Avenue, on which the Ball family they lived and worked at various periods. To the south of Euclid Avenue was basically where all the African Americans in Cleveland lived, and to the north was where there are a lot of Eastern European immigrants to the United States who were largely Catholic. And they lived in sort of religio-racial enclaves. For those of you who are familiar with the work of Robert Orsi in New York and the studies that he did of Italian Catholics in New York, we see some similarities here. Sort of life was organized around the ethnic parish. The Ball family didn't quite fit that profile because they didn't have a strong ethnic affiliation. They weren't Slovak Catholics, for example, and Slovak Catholics had a big parish in the city. But this is all to say that he's living in a very interesting time in Cleveland from a demographic perspective, but also from an economic perspective. So the next phase in the story is William Bentley Ball's time at the Cathedral Latin School, as I've said, from which he graduates in 1935. These are some images from his high school yearbook. It's hard to get some records from his time in school, but we do know a couple things. The first is that he was very involved in religious activities. So he was the president, or what at the time was called the prefect, of the Sodality of the Immaculate Conception. So we see very strongly his mother's influence on him as a young boy. His mother was very Catholic and remained so. So he was involved in sort of the religious affairs of his high school. He was also a public speaker. He was part of the debate club. Very much like his parents, I think he saw himself in some respects as a performer. He liked the limelight. And later on in his life, as I discussed in the paper, some of his more high-profile sort of political undertakings, I think, do have an air of performance that perhaps was an influence from his parents. And he was also a smart student. He was on the honor roll. He wrote quite a bit, both in his diaries and, as we'll see soon, in newspapers. And I might just also add here that for this period in the history of American Catholicism, sort of Catholic schools really helped to produce a sort of Catholic subculture. So a lot of William Bentley Ball's early life was really organized around his school, and it was there, of course, in conversation with the influences from his parents, that I think he was supplied with some of the ideas that he would later come to invoke himself. As additional way of background for this period in the history of American Catholicism, which I haven't spoken much about quite yet, in the early 20th century, as those of you who follow the Boise Center's work will know, and Mark Mass's work will know well, it was a period of real anti-Catholicism in the nation, and this was something that William Bentley Ball and his contemporaries were very aware of and familiar with, even if sometimes the extent of the perceived persecution wasn't actually quite what they said it was. It's sometimes difficult in the archival record to assess whether or not the motivations of the people who they're arguing against are actually anti-Catholic or attributable to something else. But it's to say in the early 20th century, opposition to, for example, Al Smith's presidential campaign in 1928, motivated in part by anti-Catholic prejudice. And it's not surprising that in 1925, in a case called Pierce versus the Society of Sisters, which is one of the first really parental rights cases before Yoder, that case involved an Oregon law that effectively tried to prohibit Catholic parents from sending their children to parochial schools. And so it's no surprise that that case involved Catholics as opposed to some other religious denomination. Because again, in this early 20th century period, the status of Catholics in the United States was far more uncertain than it would be even 50 years later. One of the most surprising things of my research into William Bentley Ball, I didn't think I'd be having to read much of Mexican historiography and Mexican history. But in this early 20th century period, Catholics in the United States also saw contemporaneous conflict in Mexico, or maybe not exactly contemporaneous, but at least close in time, as evidence of a pervasive anti-Catholic sentiment that pervaded sort of, if not the world, at least the United States and its southern neighbor. So one of the first pieces of writing that we have from William Bentley Ball is a 1934 essay that he writes for his school newspaper entitled Mexican Christmas, a Protest. And it's a fictitious story about a real war that occurred in Mexico called the Cristero War, where the government there prohibited Catholic clergy from participating in various sort of affairs. prohibited most forms of religious instruction in schools. And so William Bentley Ball learns about this, likely through the Catholic newspaper that's published in his town, but also the Cristero War got pretty substantial attention in the national American media as well. So in any case, in this essay in 1934, we see him articulate some of the themes. Of course, it's a fictitious story, but if we read between the lines, we see some of the themes that would later become animating in his life. So the first, of course, is an awareness of anti-Catholicism. So what the story, in short, is about, it's about a Mexican priest who's advising two young people who live in Mexico, and he counsels them to flee to the United States because of religious persecution in Mexico, and he frames the United States as a land of unparalleled religious liberty. So he says here, just this last line that I've highlighted, Ruiz, who's the priest that he creates in the story, he assured the children that they would find a new life, a place where a Catholic is a man, and where he can live to the fullest his glorious faith in the United States. And so like his father in a certain respects, he sees the United States as sort of a distinctive place and a place of real possibility for religious freedom. Maybe the third theme that I'll just highlight, and this is more implicit in the Cristero War article than in some of his later writings, but he clearly has a concern about concentrations of power, both economic and political. So as I said earlier, he never sort of takes the hardline position that the government should not be involved in anything, or there should be no government involvement in regulation or helping to improve material living standards. But he does clearly see and express concern about monopolies, really. That's the term that's often used during this period of political power. He attributes the concentration of political power in Mexico in the hands of the then president to the Cristero War, and also concentration of economic power and actually social influence also, that I discuss more in the paper. So that's the context of, that's sort of the religious context, but also sort of the economic and demographic context in which William Bentley Ball is living in Cleveland in the early 20th century. In addition to the Cristero War article, the next major piece of writing that we get from William Bentley Ball that helps us get a sense, I think, of his early thinking comes in an unsurprising context, and that is the public funding of private parochial schools. So for those of you who don't know, many state constitutions following the Northwest Ordinance, which has a provision basically saying religion and morality are good, and so we should promote schools as a means by which to promote religion and morality. A lot of state constitutions, including the 1851 Ohio Constitution, reproduced this language in their state constitutions, which seemed to suggest that public funding for religious education was something that was constitutionally acceptable as applied to the state constitutions. The federal constitution was not yet incorporated against the states at this time. So the 1851 Ohio Constitution, to Catholics at least reads as a document that permits some forms of public funding for private religious education. But at the same time, the 1851 Ohio Constitution has what's more commonly referred to as a Blaine Amendment, which it's language in the Constitution that, although it doesn't mention Catholic schools in particular, the language of these provisions was effectively designed to prohibit the public financing of Catholic schools. So this is a classic sort of remnant of late 19th century and early 20th century anti-Catholicism. This was present in the 1851 Ohio Constitution. In the 1870s, there are big debates about amending the Ohio Constitution to remove this language. Catholic delegates go to the convention and make claims about this is unjust. But the Catholics lose that debate by the 1870s. Nevertheless, Catholics still try to read into the Ohio Constitution the possibility of public funding for private religious education. And this takes on a really, sort of a really serious, what's the right word for it? It takes on a really serious dimension, I would say, after the Great Depression, because the financial status of Catholic parents in cities like Cleveland declines pretty substantially. What Catholics in Cleveland, as in other cities of this time, say is that if Catholic parents who were being quote-unquote double taxed, so they were paying money to the public school system but they felt as though they could not send their children to the public school system because they were either they were called soft Protestant establishments because there was prayer and Bible reading from King James Version of the Bible or something like that in these schools. So Catholic parents said sometimes we can't send our children to the public schools because you made them into Protestant schools, so we have to spend money for our children to go to the Catholic schools. And so these are the arguments that they make at the Ohio Constitutional Convention in the 1870s, and they say this is unfair. They lose that debate. But as a result of the fact that Catholics are the one who are bearing the economic brunt of sending their children to parochial schools, after the Great Depression, they say we need help because without public financial assistance, our Catholic schools will close. This is bad, A, because you're forcing us now to send our children to the quasi-Protestant schools that we just said we can't send our children to, but also it's bad because the public school system can't take in all of these students. It's not possible. If all the parochial schools closed, there'd be too many students in the public schools. And so this creates a major fight, as it was known to people during the period, including William Bentley Ball. And that fight, for various reasons, including the fact that the bishop at the time had quite the public persona, the fight for parochial school aid in Ohio is centered in Cleveland. And it's here that we start to see the arguments, more specifically in the context of parochial school aid, that would later recur in Lemon. And this is really the critical, this is a critical set of sources that we have about the early instantiations of this way of thinking about public funding for private religious education. So before I turn to what Ball says about this, it's just worth quoting here from Bishop Joseph Schrems, who I just mentioned, who describes the fight for parochial school aid in Ohio at this time using terms that's actually borrowed from Plessy versus Ferguson. So after, in the early 1930s, there's the governor, with the support of Catholics, makes a proposal to the state legislature to fund what's called all schools, meaning fund Catholic schools in addition to other types of schools via a new tax. And the theory behind this was that sort of now what we think of as school vouchers. The state was going to create a tax, it was going to generate money, and then the money would be given to parents to use at schools of their choice. That proposal is shot down by the state legislature, and what Bishop Schrems says in response is he borrows language from Justice John Marshall Harlan, who's the great dissenter in Plessy versus Ferguson, and he says, no question, the question being the right of Catholic schools to have access to public monies, no question is ever settled until it's settled right. So it's pretty remarkable to me, I think, that he's using this really powerful language from the dissent in Plessy and now applying it to the context of parochial school aid. So I think that's just an illustration of really the stakes that Catholics thought this debate had. So as I mentioned, there are two major pieces of writing from William Bentley Ball's very early life where we get a sense of his early thinking and his early intellectual formation. And one of them, the second one that I'll discuss today, is when he joins the fight for parochial school aid in Cleveland in the early 1930s. So I have here on the screen a long quote, you don't need to read the whole thing, from an article that he writes in the Catholic Universe Bulletin, which is the local Catholic newspaper in Cleveland. And he's describing a bill, the Davis Bill, which is one of the proposed pieces of legislation that would have provided some forms of public financial assistance to parochial schools. And what does he do in this article? First, he associates opposition to parochial school aid in the form of the Davis Bill with anti-Catholic prejudice from the late 19th and early 20th century. So he describes opponents of the Davis Bill as resurrecting what he called a church-state ogre. That church-state ogre was sort of a stand-in for anti-Catholic opposition to Al Smith's presidential campaign in 1928. He also channels language from the court's 1925 decision in Pierce that I discussed earlier, in which Justice James McReynolds, writing for the majority, asks rhetorically, is the child the mere creature of the state? So this is a very famous line for parental rights advocates. So he's also channeling this Supreme Court precedent, not unlike Bishop Schrems, obviously in a different context, but they're clearly trying to draw on legal precedent from the court that they think serves their efforts to obtain public financial assistance. He also expresses concern in the article about standardization, which in the early 20th century imagination is connected to totalitarianism, and concentrations of, as I said earlier, political and economic power. So by standardization, what William Bentley Ball is referring to is the theory, as I suggested earlier, that if Catholic parents are economically coerced to sending their children into the public school system, they were going to be standardized. The Catholic children were going to become like every other child. And this, for Catholics of the period, was obviously a problem. And then finally, and this is something maybe we can talk about more in the Q&A, because I don't quite get into it in the paper that much, but it's really important now for our contemporary legal debates, is William Bentley Ball, like other Catholics of the period, articulates the legal rationale for public support for private parochial education by dividing the religious and secular functions of parochial schools. Nowadays, you might have heard the term pervasively sectarian school or pervasively religious school. Nowadays, school choice advocates do not divide the religious and secular functions of parochial schools for the purposes of obtaining state aid. But in the early 20th century, they had to, because the argument was that because Catholic schools provide the secular function of preparing young children for life out in the real world, they should be eligible on the same terms as other types of schools for public financial assistance. And then they said, in addition, these Catholic schools provide children with sound moral training, and this is good because we want to promote Americanism or some different formulation of the term. So this division between the religious and secular functions of schools is something that we'll see again in Lemon, but there's discontinuity with today's debates for various reasons that I'm happy to discuss later. So William Bentley Ball writes this as a senior in high school. His next move is to Western Reserve University, now known as Case Western Reserve University. I don't want to say too much here for the sake of time, but I'll just say that it's during William Bentley Ball's time in college that he sort of becomes your classic Catholic anti-communist. He establishes, classic from the perspective of the historiography. He founds this organization in the city of Cleveland to promote anti-communism. He gets into this big debate in New York that Eleanor Roosevelt is interestingly involved in. But maybe just one thing I'll say about his anti-communism is one of the interesting things is, as I've written about in a recent article in the Law and History Review, one of William Bentley Ball's mentors in law school was a man by the name of Clarence Mannion, who became a very famous sort of conservative political pundit, but before that was the dean of the Notre Dame Law School. And I have good evidence that Mannion took a particular liking to Ball, perhaps because of his views, perhaps because he thought he was a smart student, who knows for what reason. But even before Ball joins the law school at Notre Dame as a student, people in his organization, in his anti-communist organization that he had founded in Cleveland, were asking for copies of a book that Clarence Mannion had written in 1939 called Lessons in Liberty, in which Mannion makes many of the same moves as Ball and other Catholics broadly of the period, describing, critiquing standardization, saying that the diversity of our country, meaning the sort of educational pluralism, is the essence of freedom in the United States, as contrasted with uniform standardization. And we see appeals to parasitic central governing power. Again, this is framing around totalitarianism. And then, of course, the conclusion, the godless tenets of dictatorial governments is a very typical form of Catholic anti-communism concerned about what became known as atheistic communism. Okay, and so now to conclude here. So what does everything I just tell you? What did everything I just tell you? How does that shed new light on the Lemon litigation, about which we know relatively little actually from a historical perspective? Well, I think it's this. I think it's that the arguments that William Bentley Ball invokes in Lemon and the reasons that he takes on the Lemon representation in coordination with some other Catholic organizations in Pennsylvania, the seeds of those arguments are sown in the early 20th century when the status of Catholics in the United States looks much different. And that's why he describes the fight in Lemon as the century of struggle for school choice. The century of struggle, 1971 is when Lemon's decided, so going back to the 1870s, that century is when 1870s through the early 20th century is when Catholics in the United States, their population increases substantially, and it's also during that early period when we see the most virulent forms of anti-Catholicism. So this is why he describes the fight for school choice in Lemon as indeed a fight. And parochial school aid advocates today still describe the fight for parental rights and for public funding of private religious education as a fight. And I think there's a lot of continuity there. So I'll just highlight very briefly some four themes that we see from William Bentley Ball's early intellectual formation that make their way into the debates over Lemon, and also I think the school choice movement that William Bentley Ball had literally an indispensable role in helping to get off the ground. So the first is that both in the early 20th century and during the 1970s, late 1960s, early 1970s debates over parochial school aid, Ball and other Catholics are operating amidst a backdrop of pretty substantial economic crisis, or at least perceived economic crisis. Again, in the early 20th century, it was related to the Great Depression and what money Catholic parents had to send their children to parochial schools. In the 1970s, also, a year to the day before William Bentley Ball argued Lemon, President Nixon puts out a statement to the nation basically saying that if we don't find a way to help shore up the economic foundations of our school system, we're going to have some serious problems. So in both contexts, they're operating against a real material background, a really scary material background. The second, as I suggested earlier, is in the Lemon litigation, William Bentley Ball divides the religious and secular functions of parochial schools. Part of this is because a couple years before Lemon, there was another case, Board of Education versus Allen, which seemed to require this. But this is something perhaps we can talk about later. The third is that although he argues Lemon before his major parental rights case, Wisconsin versus Yoder, everything related to the Lemon litigation has to do with parental rights. And it's that parents should not be coerced economically or otherwise into sending their children to schools that they don't themselves approve of. And then finally, and this is more so true outside of the legal briefing, because legal briefing's often formalistic, the arguments that are made in support of the parochial school aid statute that's passed in Pennsylvania are often connected to, discursively at least, anti-monopoly, anti-standardization, pro-parental rights. And William Bentley Ball, what he does is he frames the provisioning of aid to private religious education as a way to promote the valuable goal of educational diversity. And I think very much today we still live in the wake of Lemon, both legally and I think politically. And so I've hoped today to show that in order to understand both what's going on in the late 20th century and I think today, we need to go to a period that seems far more foreign to us because that's where the seeds of the debate are sown. Thank you.
We have about 20 minutes for Q&A.
Sure, Jack.
Thank you very much for your legal history of all of this. It's fascinating to see, kind of the background of Ball and what's going on in the law. I was wondering though if you might find it helpful to connect it to sort of what was going, at least when it comes to Lemon, on in the church at the same time. Because if you read, I taught Lemon versus Kurtzman. And what you have in the late 60s and early 70s is a situation where it's not just that you're protecting the right to go to Catholic schools. It's that Catholic schools are getting hugely more expensive because all the nuns have left and the priests have left, so they have to pay lay people to start teaching. And so what you find is in Rhode Island, one of the states as well as Pennsylvania, very, very highly Catholic states, you've got the federal government state government rather, saying, hey, we would like to be able to do this because we cannot handle the tax burden of all of these kids who are getting educated for peanuts, basically, in the Catholic school system, coming into the rolls now. So we need to help these places out. So how did Ball respond? What was his? Do you have any sense of? I understand his sense of what was going on in the country, but I would also be very interested in hearing about, what his response was to sort of the changes going on in the church that all of a sudden and equally made it more expensive and difficult for Catholics to fund their kids' education.
So his relationship to Vatican II is something that which of course is the sort of monumental event around which a lot of these events are happening, or around which a lot of these dynamics are changing. His relationship to Vatican II is a complicated one that I'm still trying to work the details out. He critiqued some very vociferous opponents of Vatican II who just said, like, the council's illegitimate, things like that. So maybe what Mark Massa would call the fundamentalist wing of the American Catholic Church. So he doesn't find himself in that camp. He's also somewhat wary of some of the developments, but at the same time, he's using sort of the idea that Catholics should go out into the world and that they should sort of bring the resources of the church into conversation with modern developments. He very much sees sort of Catholic schools as part of the way that becomes possible. So it remained. I need to spend more time working out. It's a little bit unclear in the extant archival material, but he traveled to Rome sometimes to meet with bishops. So he was very much in the milieu that would have been around the high-powered prelates who were thinking about the council's implications. But I still need to work it out a little bit more.
Hey, thanks so much for your talk. Welcome back.
Thanks.
So I'm really interested in the idea of educational pluralism that you're talking about in this discourse, and I'm not sure if that's contemporary to his language or if that's our language, but one of the things that strikes me, in its analogs is that, we may like the Second Amendment, but we don't ask the government to buy guns for everybody. We may like the First Amendment, but we don't ask the government to build a Lutheran church for communities that don't have one, et cetera. And with regard to education, I wonder, as someone who was against big government in the way that you're using contemporary language about him, but does he also think that the government should be sponsoring communist schools and KKK schools and Jewish schools and Islamic schools and tribal schools and all the other kinds of things that fit into this category of educational pluralism, or was he just truly focused on Catholic schools deploying the language of educational pluralism?
That's an excellent question. Thank you. So the best way that I've been thinking about this is actually in light of another project that I just completed, which is on William Bentley Ball's representation of Bob Jones University and its tax exemption litigation against the federal government in the 1980s. So for those of you who don't know, the Carter administration initially revokes Bob Jones University's tax exemption, its charitable tax exemption, because it's a religious school, because there was a ban on interracial dating. Formally, they barred the admission of African American students in the policy. And so the reason why this is relevant to your question is because the idea that for proponents of school choice, both at this level and also at the college level, taxes, the tax exemption, seem to be very similar to the idea of public funding, because tax exemption, the theory was that if the tax exemption is revoked, like these schools will go out of business, in the same way as the arguments in the 70s and in the 30s were, if you don't give us money, we'll go out of business. So they're thinking about all these things in a similar way. And Bob Jones is really the best example I have of how William Bentley Ball thinks about schools that he personally finds objectionable. So I have a wealth of evidence from his diaries, from correspondence, privately held, often correspondence that I've received permission to use. He found Bob Jones's anti-interracial dating policies and related racially segregative practices completely objectionable. He said, after 1958 in the United States, if you were an American Catholic lawyer who worked at all with bishops, you could not support racial segregation because of a statement of the bishops. William Bentley Ball had actually helped to craft early civil rights statutes in Pennsylvania. So all to say that he found racial discrimination personally quite objectionable. And yet, he defended Bob Jones's right to retain its tax exemption. So he did have a pretty capacious understanding of the types of institutions that the government should be able to fund, whether via the tax exemption or direct financial support. And he connects this in the same way to like his support for the Amish in Wisconsin versus Yoder. He didn't believe, of course, in the Amish way of life and the Amish sort of means by which the Amish raise their youth. But he saw both Bob Jones and the Amish as part and parcel of this broader sort of anti-standardization campaign. So, of course, there must be limits to that line of argument, but I don't yet have a clear sense, at least for him, where that line was.
Yeah, but the taking away tax exemptions versus having the government pay everybody to pay for all the students directly is a big step, you know. And,
yeah, it seems to us.
For him, yeah.
It didn't for them though.
Okay.
They thought about, they really saw the revocation of tax exemption in the same way as direct financial assistance.
Yeah.
Which is an interesting thing that I guess I haven't really thought about.
Cool, thanks.
Hi, Dennis. Good to have you back. You're a credit to the BC History Department. Loved your primary sources. I'm interested in this idea of parents' rights and going back to this idea of the Vatican. I mean, this is when I think about other places in the world that I work on at this time, an idea of parents' rights is not one that you hear about a lot. So I don't know if is it anywhere else used in church language? Yeah, and so maybe even just a little more intellectual history of that, and then marrying it. It sounds like to the civil rights movement in America, right? And so. How exceptionally American is it?
Yeah, it's a great question. So it's not exceptionally American because of the idea of parental rights in the American Catholic Church is derivative of a natural law rooted view of the family. So I've argued in a separate piece that after 1947, in a case called Everson versus Board of Education, which was another one of these big Establishment Clause disputes, after 1947, Catholics in the United States, especially their lawyers, started invoking parental rights everywhere. Everything is about parental rights. And this, I think, I need to work this out in subsequent work. This lays the foundation for what's now known as sort of the Protestant Catholic coalition building around parental rights in the later 20th century and even still today. That's a Catholic argument, not a Protestant argument for most of the 20th century. And although the argument takes on a new life after 1947, the intellectual resources behind it are all connected to the natural law tradition. So we have evidence from the late 19th century through the early 20th century that the reason why Catholics were thinking about parental rights is because they had a natural law rooted conception of the relationship between husband and wife and parent and child. And so there's this one great image that I have in another article. There's a light shining down from heaven on this child, and there's a picture of his parents on one side and a picture of like a cityscape on the other side. And it's like, the child, God is leading the child to one side and not the other side. So the idea has deep Catholic intellectual history type roots, but other groups subsequently take on the term, and now it has a total life of its own.
It's great to see you, Dennis.
Yeah, great to see you.
It feels like just yesterday you were in undergrad classes. It's amazing. I have questions that build on these. I also was wondering about specific contextual changes in the Catholic Church, and I was thinking of Stephen Coates' book, Crabgrass Catholicism, who I think showed Crabgrass Catholicism. I think it just came out this fall. I think he does a great job showing that there's like a true Catholic financial crisis in the post-war era for the reasons we've outlined: shortage of priests, sisters, declining enrollment, rising costs, increasing religious disaffiliation, and so on. That this, so the push, it's different than the Great Depression, but there's a real monetary reason to push for state aid. And secondly, I was also thinking about the relationship to the civil rights movement and school desegregation litigation. So in using the language school choice, the case that comes to mind is New Kent County in 1968, Green v. New Kent County. It's a huge turning point in school desegregation in 1968 because it invalidates freedom of choice plans, which is one of these evasive tactics that southern municipalities used. And so, big picture, I'm wondering about how the relationship between civil rights litigation and how Ball was thinking about this, because it's very telling that they're pointing to Plessy as the model. So I think it's probably fair to say that NAACP and Brown v. Board is kind of the model for legal change in this era. And so and as a proponent of civil rights himself, and yet it's kind of puzzling that they're increasingly using the language that the opponents of school desegregation are using, right? That's school choice, freedom of choice, and that might put them in kind of a pickle, right? And I wonder how they're dealing with that. Is there an opportunity for alliance, with the opponents of school desegregation, or is that something they would want to avoid being associated with the Jim Crow supporters? I don't know.
I'm glad you guys are asking about this because I literally am just wrapping up this other project which takes on this question directly.
Yes. Okay.
So So the story that I lay out in this other article, and I'm still trying to think through it because it's a complicated story. So, as I said, so Catholics after 1958, especially the lawyers, who are the primary group I study, who are associated with bishops at all, you can't express any support for racial discrimination. The church's leaders have just barred it categorically. And I have evidence of, part of the reason why I talk about his father's views on race early is because I think growing up, he's certainly not being instructed in sort of, I have no evidence of an early intellectual formation in a race-related way. And I have evidence of him working on pro-civil rights initiatives in the 60s. John F. Kennedy actually calls him to the White House the day after the Civil Rights Act is introduced to the nation for a meeting on race and religion. But what happens is, beginning in the early 1970s, many states, so we're dealing primarily in state court, it's an interesting phenomenon, states start enacting these these very detailed curricular regulations. Hiring practices start getting regulated. So there's this whole group of regulations that start being passed. And frequently the primary targets of these regulations are fundamentalist, so Protestant day schools, basically. Sometimes those schools are connected to segregation academies, but sometimes they were just founded for other reasons. So William Bentley Ball, beginning in the 1970s and extending through his representation of Bob Jones in the 1980s, starts taking on all of these fundamentalist cases, fundamentalist school cases, where the schools are trying to resist state efforts to regulate their internal religious affairs. So why is this responsive to your question? It's that the best case that I have from this period preceding Bob Jones, where we see the race and religion dynamics that you're pointing to come through in the most crystallized way, is a case in North Carolina, which is one of the hubs of the segregation academy movements. And what William Bentley Ball says is actually the statutes that make massive resistance possible through funding these private schools, actually that's a problem because these statutes allow the government to exert more control over private religious education than not. So the arguments that it's sort of a tragic story because the arguments that he's making for school choice, educational pluralism, whatever, they do get picked up by genuine racists who are trying to, especially in southern states, create a system of privately segregated religious schools. But again, it's sort of a sad story because the reasons why he's making those claims isn't related to the segregation academy movement. And in fact, when Bob Jones's case goes to the Supreme Court, he expresses a ton of concern that Bob Jones's case would get consolidated with another case called Goldsboro Christian Schools. And Goldsboro prohibited the admissions of African Americans altogether. And William Bentley Ball says, well, if our case gets consolidated with Goldsboro, we're definitely going to lose because Goldsboro, he thinks, has made fake claims to religious liberty and is actually just trying to mask its segregation. So it's a very complicated story that cuts against some of the received wisdom about the conservative legal movement's relationship to segregation academies and to race and religion generally, in part because a lot of the studies don't focus on Catholics at all, really. They just don't figure because a lot of the fundamentalist schools are Protestant or they're related to evangelical schools. So that's the other project I'm working on, but it'll take time for me to flesh it out more.
I'm sorry, well, we have 2 minutes. So feel free to get in your last
I'll
question.
hang around.
Continue after.
Sure.
So you mentioned the transition from Ball's era of stressing the religious and the secular aspects of things, and nowadays the movement supporting parental choice and school choice tends to not do that, right? And so that story needs, I feel like, to be explored more, like how that transition happened because of all of these contexts that you're discussing, right? Like what happened over the course of the 20th century. That seems to be an underexplored narrative shift, logical shift that has been made. Because otherwise I don't think we can understand why today's movement that doesn't stress that there is a separate secular or religious aspect of these schools that treats them either in the language you use, pervasively religious, pervasively secular, why would they then use Ball, right? Like, why go back to the arguments Ball was making if the grounds on which they're arguing are completely different? And so how that shift occurred seems to be critical to this story, because a shift definitely did occur, and who was involved and when it was involved and which factions and which ideological sides took over and became dominant seems to be critical to understanding how the arguments that Ball was making, which many people might agree with, no longer relevant to how it's being argued, and yet still going back to Ball's arguments, right? And so that transition, that narrative seems to be something that I would love to hear more about. If you have explored it, or if you haven't explored it, I would encourage you to do so.
Yeah, sure. Maybe I'll just say super quickly. So the reason the development is related to a concept in the law called the church autonomy doctrine. And so what happens is in the 20th century, these are actually other cases that Ball argues, primarily for Catholic schools that are fighting NLRB jurisdiction over hiring practices in their schools. So what happens is Ball creates, now the term is called church autonomy, but it's the autonomy of religious institutions to conduct their hiring and firing practices in accordance with whatever they say their religious dictates are. And so it's in those cases that we see this parallel argument where just the school altogether is religious. You're right to sort of see the tension in there because we have parallel arguments. Sometimes they come together, sometimes they don't. I need to do some more thinking about why today one has proven triumphant, but there's definitely a story of continuity and Ball's at the heart of it.
Thank you so much.
Please join me in thanking Dennis.
Here, Matt, I don't know how to.
Oh, sure. Thank you.